Hello class, it's great to be back with you again. You've made it through the first week of school. Welcome back at the beginning of the semester. It's exciting to have you in the class, and I'm excited to see your interactions in the discussion forum and your responses to the project survey and other things like that. So today I just wanted to provide a brief overview of the foundations of organizational change, specifically looking at several of the different types of change models that are common as we think about organizational development and change. So to start things off, I think it's important just to frame change generally. Okay, so if you look at this diagram of the action research model, and you may recall in the previous lecture in the history of OD, there was a brief little piece in that diagram that talked about action research as being a really important form of OD that emerged several decades ago and has continued on to today. Well, here's the action research model. You start with problem identification. You move to consultation with behavioral scientists who have expertise in those particular areas that are of a challenge to the organization. You data gather and preliminary diagnosis. You feed back to the client. Then there's joint diagnosis, joint action planning, action, data gathering after the action, which loops back to feedback, and then it's this ongoing process. If you look at this model, I'm hoping that very quickly you start to notice something. It's not rocket science. In reality, if you look at this and think back to like your elementary school days when you prepared for a science fair or something like that, you'll notice that this is really just basically the scientific method applied to an organizational setting dealing with behavioral scientists. So I think what you'll see over and over and over again as we look at these different models is that it's the same thing, just taking a slightly different approach to how we understand change within an organization. Is we're using the scientific method. Identify a problem, consult with experts, or go find what experts have said about the issue through literature review and those sorts of things, gather data, do preliminary analysis, talk with your client, create a plan, implement the plan into an action, and then continue to collect data for assessment purposes, and then you figure out what's working, what's not working, you revise, and you keep going over and over and over again. That's basically what we're doing in organizational development. Here's another way of looking at it. So this is called the positive model. First, you initiate the inquiry. So you have an organization that has a problem. You talk with them as a consultant, either internal or external. And at that point, you try to understand what best practices are around that problem. As you're discovering best practices, either through talking to people, other people in the industry, reading the literature, whatever the case may be, then you start to discover themes. You envision a preferred future for the organization in relation to that problem, and then you design and deliver ways of creating that future. You action plan, you implement, you evaluate, so on and so forth. So again, it's really just another way of understanding the action research model in a way that's inquiry-based, that takes you to creating the future that you want for your organization. There are, again, many types of models, and I'm going to talk about a few more here in just a moment. But first, I wanted to provide a quick comparison of some of the types of planned change models. So in terms of similarities, in every model, you're going to be looking at change, but it's always preceded by diagnosis or preparation. And so sometimes haphazard organizations will bring people in to initiate change, or an executive or a manager will decide they want to initiate some form of change. It may be small, it may be large, but ultimately they start to implement things without really going through the diagnosis and preparation stage. That's a fairly common mistake that people make in organizations, and when that happens, the change almost always fails. Again, whether it's a small change or a wide-scale change, change is hard for people to accept. And so when change does happen successfully, when it's managed successfully within organizations, it's always going to be preceded by diagnosis, by preparation, by getting buy-in from various stakeholders, all those sorts of things. There's always going to be an application of behavioral science knowledge. Now remember last time we talked a little bit about all the different fields of the social sciences. You have history, you have political science, you have demography, you have sociology, psychology, anthropology, organizations, business. You have all these different areas, each that brings their own lens to a problem. And to the extent possible, you want to have, as a change agent within an organization, you want to have as much of a holistic picture of the problem as you can, and you want to understand and tackle it from all angles as much as you can. Now, you can't be expected to have expertise in all areas, and that's why we go out and do literature reviews. That's why we go out and talk to experts and do interviews with experts. That's why we search out industry best practices. All those elements are behavioral science knowledge application and trying to really understand the problem. I already mentioned this a little bit, but it stresses the involvement of organizational members. You have to have buy-in from stakeholders throughout the organization. And if you don't, the change is going to fail. And also recognizing the role of a consultant. Now, again, this could be an internal consultant, someone who works within the organization. Say it's a large company. They have an internalized consulting arm that goes out and helps with these sorts of issues. Maybe it's an external consultant. You hire a firm to come in and help with change. Or maybe it's happening just through change agents who are in other managerial or executive roles within the company, but they take on that kind of mantle as a change agent to drive forward change. You just need to be clear on the role of the consultant, the role of the change agent, and how they fit into the bigger picture. Now, in terms of differences, each of these models have variations, and I just showed you two, and already you see some differences, even though there's also some similarities. Some of them are very general, some of them are much more specific and focus on specific activities. Some of them focus on the centrality of a consultant role. Some are more problem-solving approaches versus social constructionism, where you're trying to understand the totality of the social interactions and everything of that nature. What you'll see if you start to go out and look at different consulting firms that do change initiatives is they'll each have their own model of change, and they'll each claim that they have found the secret sauce of how to do change correctly and implement it correctly and have the best outcomes, and that's what they sell. And then they go into organizations and they try to have a good interaction with their clients and have good outcomes. And that's fine. You would expect that for an organization to try to differentiate, try to have their own kind of unique model, and then pitch and sell that model to people. The reality is all these models are fairly similar because they all basically come back to the scientific method and what I call the general model of planned change, which you see here, where you come in, you enter a contract with the organization. So you're creating a relationship. Now, again, if you're an internal person, you still have to do this step because you're working with other departments and other divisions within the organization. If you're an external consultant, then you have to go find clients and you have to go find organizations that are willing to work with you. And in the entering and contracting stage, you will start to define the project, the scope and scale, the terms, all of the different specific elements of what needs to be accomplished. This is the very first thing you are all going to be doing in your team consulting projects. So as your teams get formed this week, next week you're going to have your first team meetings. You're going to set up your first client meetings to talk with your organization, and you're going to have those very first discussions to try to really understand what do they really need, what's the problem they're facing, how do they want to address it, what's your role, what's the scope and scale of your project, and you're going to start to put together a project proposal. All of that is the entering and contracting stage. Once you get past that stage, you move into diagnosing. This is where you start to collect data. You conduct interviews, surveys, you do literature reviews, you scan the internet and look for industry best practices, all of that sort of stuff. You collect data to try to understand what's happening, what the problem truly is. Is the problem as they understand it within the organization, as they're explaining it to you, or is it something a little bit different? That happens in the diagnosing stage. Then you move to planning and implementing change. So based on the data, based on the diagnosing and the initial results that you're finding, then you have to plan actions that can influence the type of change that you want to see happen. You do the planning, then you do the implementation, and then that moves you into evaluating and institutionalizing change. Once you start implementation, you have to evaluate, you have to assess, you have to see, is it sustainable change? Does it have the impact that you intend it to have? Are you institutionalizing the change so it'll last beyond you as the consultant coming in, or it'll last beyond a particular manager or an executive who is kind of their pet project, and then they move on, they go somewhere else, and then all of a sudden it falls apart. That's not what you want. And so you want to make sure that you evaluate, that you institutionalize, that you embed, and you make sure that it's firm and in place. Okay, with all that said, that's the general scope. The last few slides you'll see talk about a few other specific models. I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but feel free to explore each of these a little bit more. Google them. These are really old models that have been around for a really long time, and most organizations' kind of secret sauce models of change are based on these models. They just tweak them and kind of change them a little bit. So here you can see systems theory models of change, where you have inputs, you have some sort of transformational and transformative process, and then positive outputs. And then throughout that whole process, you have feedback. There's 4 different specific types that fit into this: Lewin's force field analysis, Burke-Litwin, the Weisbord, and the Nadler-Tushman. Now, if you've taken organizational behavior, you may be somewhat familiar with these models. They're fairly straightforward. Lewin's force field analysis basically says that organizations are built to reinforce the status quo. They're there to sustain themselves and to maintain consistency. And so if you want to drive change, what you have to do first and foremost is disrupt the status quo. You have to put in place new policies, practices, procedures, new narratives, new ways of explaining the reality of the organization in such a way that people recognize change is important and inevitable, the resistance for change goes down, and then people can start to implement new processes. So you see the arrows pointing down, the arrows pointing up. That just refers to all these different internal and external forces that are always just putting pressure to keep things the same. And if those forces don't change, nothing's ever going to change. This model obviously is way more complex than the previous one. But again, you have inputs, you have transformation process, and you have outputs. And then there's more specific elements within each of those. You have the environment, resources and history that drive strategy, that influences your tasks, your informal organization, your formal organization arrangements, all the individuals within the organization. And then you can tweak all of those things, and then that can drive the outputs for organization level, group level, and individual level outputs for an organization. Here, the Burke-Litwin model for organizational performance and change, again, much more complex. You can see all of the different elements that tend to have an influence on that status quo that we saw in the force field model. So if you're looking for ways to disrupt the status quo, these are all, this is a great model to help you think about some of the different elements that you can start to adjust and tweak and influence to get people to start to consider change and be open to change. The Weisbord 6-box model, again, some really key elements and some really good questions. What business are we in? How did we divide up the work? Do all needed tasks have incentives? Have we adequate coordinating technologies? How do we manage conflict among people with technologies? Does someone keep the box in balance? These are all really just core foundational questions that we need to be asking ourselves all the time as we're trying to understand an organization and drive good, positive change within the organization. With that, I think, and there's a slide for a group activity, which obviously we're not going to do, but it's a good thing to think about and consider. Think about all the models of change and perhaps try to develop your own model of change and how an OD practitioner can lead change within an organization. Thanks, and see you next week.